So, I would like to welcome you all, dear guests, to our final event of that term. Today we have a legendary speaker with us, Vladimir Pozner.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I take exception to that introduction. There's nothing legendary about me. I would like to clarify a couple of things before we get down to this subject. I am not representing anybody except myself. I hold 3 citizenships, Russian, American, and French. So I'm a mix of different things. And I am a journalist. And I see my duty as a journalist to try to be as objective and as balanced as possible, regardless of what my political and other views may be. And when I speak today, that's what I'm going to be trying to do. When I finish speaking, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. But I'm asking you in advance to ask questions, not to pronounce speeches. And not to try to engage me in a debate. I've not come to debate anyone. If you have questions, I'll do my best to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I'll say so. So, having said that, there's a, oh, I didn't have to take off and watch this. A thing up there, okay. This talk, I call it Russia Today. And it should not be confused with the television network and agency of the same name that is probably Russia's main foreign policy propaganda arm. A television venue called, a television network called Russia Today, and an agency called Russia Today. Very different things. I don't intend to speak about them. I don't intend to speak about the Russian media, although if you have questions about that during the Q&A session, I'll be happy to answer those questions. And so, let me discuss the issue at hand, that is Russia Today. But let me also say that I'm, in this particular case, neither a friend of Putin's nor a foe of Putin's. Neither pro nor contra. Some things I support, some things I strongly oppose. But as I said at the beginning, I try to be objective and balanced. For about 3/4 of the 20th century, over 75 years, the world was divided into 2 camps. In broad terms, you had 2 opposed ideologies. One represented mainly by the United States, and the other represented almost solely by the Soviet Union. Initially, as you probably know, no one recognized the existence of the Soviet Union. The United States recognized it only in 1932. The relationship was always a strained one. The appearance of the Soviet Union led to things like the Red Scare in the United States, the fear of communism. If you were to look up cartoons of those days in American newspapers and magazines, you'd see a bearded individual holding a knife clenched between his teeth with a smoking bomb in one hand, a fur hat that said Bolshevik. And you could find the equivalent of the other side in the Soviet magazines. What I'm pointing out is that both sides were afraid of each other, both sides disliked each other, and both sides, to a certain extent, feared each other. The relationship did not really improve And when it became apparent that there would be a war, and I'm speaking about the Second World War, the West did what it could to see to it that Hitler would strike east rather than anywhere else. And when he did attack the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, a senator from the state of Missouri, by the name of Harry S. Truman, who was to become vice president and then president of the United States, said, and I quote, "If we see that the Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. And if we see that the Russians are winning, we should help the Germans. And see to it that they kill as many of each other as possible." I repeat, this man became president of the United States. But there was, after all, we were allies. The Russians and the Americans, sort of, fought the war together. And there was a short period of time when it seemed that there could be a kind of an agreement, a kind of a rapprochement between the two sides. That hope was very short-lived, as you know, and the fear that had always existed now became much greater because the Soviet Union had become a huge military power. It didn't yet have the A-bomb, but it certainly had one soon enough. That was a time when the phrase Iron Curtain was coined by a man by the name of Winston Churchill in the United States, where he spoke about an Iron Curtain that had descended in Europe. And that was soon the time when the notion of Cold War first became known. A war different from all other wars because it was not one where people killed each other, but nonetheless a war of ideologies. The two sides, the West led by the United States and the Soviet Union with the countries that on the one hand it had occupied as a result of World War II, but also countries that supported it, such as China in those days, and North Korea and Vietnam, were facing off. And it seemed very close to a war. Need I remind you of 1962 and the missile crisis in Cuba. There was something very special about that situation, especially for the United States, because up until that time, the United States had seen itself as a country that could not be destroyed by any other country. It had weak neighbors to the south and to the north. And it had two oceans, the west and the east. It could not be reached. Now here was a country that, having atomic weapons and later nuclear weapons and missiles, could actually destroy the United States. And be destroyed, but destroy the United States. This is a totally new notion. I remember very well how children were taught how to hide under desks in case of a nuclear alert, although that wouldn't really help. But that's the way many Americans were brought up. And so the attitude towards Russians over those 78 years, not only in America, but in Europe as well, became a very negative attitude. In general, the view of the quote-unquote West, whatever that means, I mean, where does the West begin? At what point do you say, this is West? Is it Poland? Many people would say, no, that's not West. But what is it? Germany? Well, yeah, I guess. So, the West had a strange feeling about this country called Russia. This dates way back. I'm not going to take you back in history centuries, but it's worthwhile looking up what Russia was seen as after the Tartar yoke was thrown off and foreigners started coming to Russia, including an English merchant by the name of John Fletcher, who wrote a very interesting book about the Russians. And if you read what he wrote back then, a lot of it is repeated in what you read today, strangely enough. Strange people, unpredictable, different from us. But I'm going to leave that aside. 78 years of this face-off has led to a situation where psychologically, people on both sides, but more so in the West, I would say, than in Russia, react to the word itself. If you say Russia, your average Westerner, and especially American person, will react differently than if you say the word China, or France, or Norway. There's something about Russia, and it's got a history. This plays a role in attitudes. I have a friend, call him a friend. You probably know him. He's a well-known movie director by the name of Anton Charovsky, who once said to me, the problem is we look too much like them. If we were of a different color or had polka dots, they wouldn't expect us to be like them. And they'd leave us alone. But we look like them. And they expect us to behave like they behave. And we don't. And that creates problems. During the 15 minutes while I was waiting for the clock to hit 6 o'clock, we were talking upstairs, and one of the gentlemen I was with said to me, when we said this issue of homosexuality, which is now a big deal, right? Everybody hits the Russians. Does anyone say anything about India, where it's become a crime? No. And when a Russian says, well, why? Why do you go after us where it's not a crime? And you don't go after India where it is? The answer is, well, who do you want to be compared to? Europe and America or India? Which is really very hypocritical, basically. But there is that attitude. Now, there is also very little understanding of what Russia is about. Not only is there little understanding, but there's no desire to understand. I've always said that if you want to understand the other side, you have to come down from your belfry and climb up the other person's and look at it from that person's viewpoint. Then you begin to understand. Nobody does that. One thing you must understand is that for a long time for a large part of those 78 years, Gulag notwithstanding, the vast majority of Soviet citizens profoundly believed in their system. The system was held together by a glue that consisted of two parts, faith and fear. And it held it together very, very well. There was even a joke about the feeling of the average Soviet. It had to do with the fact that there was an international symposium, the aim of which was to determine the ethnicity of Adam and Eve. Because the Bible says nothing about who they were. So it was much larger than this room, as I understand. Several thousand people have come to discuss this. And the French delegate got up and he said, obviously Adam and Eve were French. Because who but a French woman would give up paradise for love? And the English delegate got up and he said, well, much as I respect my French colleague, they clearly were English. Because who but an English gentleman would give up paradise for his lady love? To which the Soviet delegate said, that is all bourgeois kvetch. They were Soviet. And we have triple proof. First, they had only one apple for the two of them. Second, they had hardly any clothing. And most importantly, they believed they were living in paradise. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they did for a very long time. And people sacrificed. They sacrificed and they sacrificed, saying, my children, they will have a life. And people gave up lives, health, Lord knows what, to build this dream society where everyone would be equal, where there would be no poverty, where there would be real justice, where money wouldn't matter, all of those things. And there was a period, not long, after Stalin's death, when Khrushchev came to power, when he made his famous speech at the 20th Party Congress, the de-Stalinization speech, and when something called the thaw began in the Soviet Union. There was a short window, not of opportunity, but of hope, that finally, life would change. That the ideals that had been promised would come true. And it seemed that they would. Living standards got much better. The first Sputnik, Gagarin. I remember people, masses of people coming out in the streets to celebrate these things. There was a real feeling that finally we will be what we always promised to be. Solzhenitsyn was published, something that was impossible. But gradually, it became apparent that the promises were not coming true, and then finally, Khrushchev was taken out. A man by the name of Brezhnev came in and stayed for the next 18 years. And the picture changed. The economy began to slow down. Shortages became apparent. People queued up for everything. People queued up, never even asking what was the queue for. The first thing you did was you got into the queue. And then you said, in Russian, что дают? What are they giving? If you didn't know, you know it was something that you had to get. Again, if you don't mind, I'll tell you what I think is one of the great jokes of that period. When a man comes to an outpatient clinic and he says, I need to see the eye-ear doctor. And the lady at the desk said, there is no such thing. There's an eye doctor, and then there's a doctor who takes care of your nose, throat, and ear. I said, no, I need the eye-ear doctor. Said, but comrade, I told you there is no such doctor. So they keep on arguing back and forth. And finally, she says, look, there is no such doctor, but if there were one, why would you want it? Well, he says, because I keep hearing one thing and seeing something completely different. But I already told you a lot about what people were beginning to think, how they were looking at their society. Back then, and I want to underline this because it's important, and I mentioned it very briefly, but I'll say it again, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You realize that the decision to place missiles in Cuba was an agreement between Khrushchev and Castro. The leaders of two independent countries decided they wanted to do this. This is perfectly legal. By any kind of international law, they have the right to do it. The United States, when it found out, said no, because it saw it as a threat to its national security. And it said, we will sink your ships if need be, and we will go to war if needs be. We will not allow it. And ultimately, Khrushchev had to pull those missiles out of Cuba, and a war was avoided. But just remember what I said, because we'll come back to the idea of what happens when a country feels that its security, its national security is threatened. And in that case, whether or not it will ignore international law. So, in comes Brezhnev, and gradually, faith disappears. fewer and fewer people believe in the system. They see this man who first has one star hero of the Soviet Union, then a second one, then the third, then the fourth, and altogether 5. More than anyone else, nobody knows why. They see privileges of the party bureaucracy increasing enormously. Their own standard of living starts to go down more and more. The KGB is no longer what it was under Stalin. It's still very powerful, but people aren't being shot anymore. There's no more gulag as there was once upon a time. So fear also goes down. If someone would pour me a glass of water, I'd be willing to pay. This is capitalism, right? What do you call it? Still? Still. That's not advertising. Still. Anyway, so still. What's more, 60% of the national budget was being spent on defense. 60%. You couldn't bear that too much. In those days, the price of oil was low. The extraction of oil was not efficient. Things were getting worse and worse and worse. A man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev was elected to the Politburo and made responsible for what was the worst job in the Soviet Union, agriculture. He went to visit a country that in many ways is similar to Russia, Canada. Far north, bad weather, lots of snow and ice, and yet wonderful agriculture. He wanted to see, how is this? The ambassador to Canada in those days, the Soviet ambassador, was a man by the name of Vladimir Vladimirovich. And they had a walk in the woods, which later became famous. And during that time, Yakovlev made it very clear that the Soviet system had to change. That things were simply not tenable anymore. And the whole idea of perestroika, the whole idea of renewal was born during that walk in the woods. This is something that I was told by both Yakovlev and Gorbachev. So, here now is a situation where Brezhnev is old, sick, doesn't understand what he's doing most of the time. Millions of jokes about poor Brezhnev. For instance, Comrade Brezhnev, you have to go back home. You're wearing one brown shoe and one black shoe. You've got to change. Yes, that's true. But at home I also have one black shoe. Poor man. Saying to his secretary, I have a speech to make tomorrow at such and such a factory, but make it short, not more than 15 minutes. Very good. Next day comes back. So how did the speech go? It went very well. But I asked for 15 minutes, and it lasted an hour. You read all 4 copies. And so, finally, and nobody replaces him on this, because who is going to be? Who's going to be the top man? Finally, he dies. And in comes a gentleman by the name of Andropov, former head of the KGB. Once upon a time, an ambassador to Hungary during the uprising of 1956. A very tough gentleman, who thankfully died within a year. At least that's my name. Many people still say he was great. The next man to come in, Chernenko, was sick even before he came in. So it was one after the other, after the other, after the other, and then finally they had to elect a new general secretary. And due to a combination of different things, Gorbachev was elected. And so, began perestroika. Let me remind you, this is the time of Ronald Reagan, who's calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, who's saying it will wind up on the dust heap of history. We're very close to war. All contacts have been ruptured. There are no more exchanges. Not educational, not cultural, not athletics, nothing. Things are looking very bad indeed. And the person who really, at least if we look at official, the person who kind of changes the two is a lady by the name of Margaret Thatcher, who meets Gorbachev and says, this is a man with whom we can do business. Now, what Gorbachev did, and he didn't always understand what he was doing, and yet he did something of absolutely historic importance. He changed the system, but he wanted it to be socialism. He wanted it to be socialism that worked. Socialism that was what it had promised to be. But what he didn't understand was that it was so bad that if you started fixing it, it would just go to pieces, which is pretty much what happened. And it could be said that that's when the Cold War stopped, because the Soviet Union could no longer participate. So when people say, well, did the Soviet Union lose the Cold War? The answer is yes. Of course it did. For better or for worse, depending on how you look at it. But it lost the Cold War. Now, one of the most important things that Gorbachev did was to announce glasnost. That is to say, openness, which you would call freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Something that had never, ever existed in Russia. I'm talking way before the revolution, after the revolution, it had never existed. The very concept of freedom in Russia is quite different from what you have, say, in England. In Russia, it's more a concept of will, not freedom, because freedom entails responsibility. A free person is a responsible person, which is why, say, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., one of the members of the U.S. Supreme Court back in the 20s and 30s, said, you cannot yell fire in a crowded movie theater just because you want to yell fire. Now, is that a limitation on freedom of speech? Yes. And that limitation is responsibility, because the consequences of your yelling fire would be catastrophic. Will says, I do what I want, and who cares? And that is much more the Russian view of what freedom is about. And that's a very profound difference, and something to keep in mind. So that was one thing that he did. That changed the country. Suddenly, people were no longer listening to the BBC in Russian. People were no longer listening to the Voice of America. People were no longer listening to the Deutsche Welle. They were all listening to their own, reading their own newspapers, standing in line to buy the latest issue of whatever newspaper it was. Suddenly, life had a new meaning. It was a tremendous change. And that was one thing. And the other thing was that he allowed the reunification of Germany. Now, mind you, there were many countries in Europe that didn't want Germany to reunify. Too strong. Too powerful. We know what Germany did in the 20th century. Do we not? We want that to happen again? Nonetheless, notwithstanding the opposition, and there were a lot of it, Gorbachev agreed to the reunification of Germany and taking down the Berlin Wall, but there was one condition. NATO does not move eastward. A very important condition. NATO stays put. James Baker, who was then Secretary of State of the United States, agreed to that. Now, I'm telling you what Gorbachev told me. I was not there, I can't vouch for it, but I see no reason why he would lie. And indeed, the reunification of Germany took place, and NATO did not budge. Now we're talking 1989. NATO did not budge until 1997. So not only was Reagan gone, but even George Bush Sr. was gone. This all happened under Clinton. It also happened after the Soviet Union disappeared, which was in 1991. And when the Russians, now there's no more Soviet, right? When the Russians say, wait a minute, we had an agreement, didn't we? The answer was, no. We had an agreement with the Soviet Union, not with Russia. Which is true, but it's also a little bit of a game. So, NATO began to expand eastward. And obviously, Russia feared that. Now, we can agree or disagree as to whether or not NATO should be considered a threat. But the Russian leadership always saw NATO as a threat. Correctly or incorrectly is inconsequential. What is important is that that was the way NATO was and is perceived. And what some would say is, look, there's no more Soviet Union. The so-called Warsaw Pact, which is a military organization, no longer exists. Why do you need NATO? And what's the answer? To protect Europe from North Korea? Or from Iran's possible nuclear missiles? Let's be open with each other. This is a major point. It's a little bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, and we're going to come into this, I certainly can go into Q&A, just to make a point. Russia will not allow NATO to be on its southern border in Ukraine. Will not allow. Doesn't matter whether Ukraine agrees, not agrees. This has nothing to do with international law. It has to do with the fact that Russia sees this as a threat to its national security. And it will not allow it. And if it has to fight, it will fight. This is something this is why I brought up the Cuban. It's not about anything but that kind of logic, which we can agree with, disagree with, it's there. All right. I'll continue on. But there was a period when Russia was saying, okay, take us into NATO. Yeltsin said that. He said, come on, let's create a new military defensive organization instead of NATO. You don't need NATO. So let's create a new one where Russia will be part of it. And what did the West say? You are not ready. Hungary is ready. Bulgaria is ready. Romania is ready. Poland, of course. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are ready. Russia's not ready. Well, that creates certain problems. It does. Objectively looking at it. So, this is one of the main issues that exists between what was now called, I guess, the two sides or whatever. I guess what should be understood is that there is no more Cold War in the sense of two ideologies. That's gone. There is a country called Russia, and there is still a certain attitude towards that country because of the past, but also because of the present. Let's not forget that Russia has always considered itself to be a great power. That Russia is a former empire. That Russians believe that they have a mission, very much like the Americans. That they have a mission in life. That they have a special path, if you will. It's very much part of the Russian outlook. And the Russian Orthodox Church has played a very active role in that area. The Russian Empire, which was created by Peter I, he was the one who announced the empire, disappeared in 1991, virtually without bloodshed. It is the only empire that has disappeared that way. The only empire. I can tell you, as someone who's been around the block a few times and who knows Russia pretty well, that many Russians were hoping that the West would now say, we're friends, and we'll help you, because Russia was in a very difficult situation economically. What actually happened was that, when I say the West, I'm really talking about the US, but I'm just using that terminology. The West basically said, you lost the Cold War. Shut up. You're no longer a great power. You're a second-rate country, maybe even third. We will make our decisions, and you'll just have to live with it. Typical example, Yugoslavia. Typical. The bombing of Yugoslavia without the UN's consent, NATO, the recognition of Kosovo, notwithstanding Russia saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Shut up. Did it. Kosovo was, in my opinion, a terrible example, because everything that followed, whether it's Abkhazia, whether it's Crimea, it's all, well, you allowed Kosovo. Well, we can do what you did. Why can't we? Russia, during the Yeltsin period, is gradually falling apart. You have the oligarchs, which is to say immensely rich people who have great political power, who got their money dishonestly. You have tremendous poverty. You have 1,000% inflation. You have governors who are running their areas like princes, like fiefdoms. You have a situation that is absolutely unbearable for the majority of the population, who, in addition to all of that, say, where is our greatness? Who are we? Who cares about us anymore? This is democracy? Well, let's go back to being Soviet. And along comes a man by the name of Vladimir Putin, who is appointed by Yeltsin, who, by the way, on New Year's Eve, on television, publicly steps down and publicly says, forgive me for what I've done. That doesn't happen very often when the head of state does something like that. Because he realized what he'd done. Or maybe he did, because Russia missed an incredible chance to really change, had he not lost control of the country. So in comes Putin, and I'm not going to go into details about it, but a man who is in his own way a patriot, who wants Russia to be strong, and who, first of all, decides that the only way to do that is to reinforce power, what he calls the vertical of power. Bring everything into shape. And he does it in different ways, by reining in the oligarchs, telling them to get out of politics or else. And when one of them refuses, by the name of Khodorkovsky, you know what happened to him, tells the governors to toe the line, clamps down on freedom of expression, on freedom of the press. Television, which was independent, is no longer independent. It's owned directly or indirectly run by the state. Dissenting voices allowed but controlled. Things change. But the thing to remember is that while the intellectual minority doesn't like that, the vast majority of the people do. Very often we, people who consider ourselves to be somewhat elite, and that we have university education, and that we've read something, a book or two, you know? And sometimes we go to museums or concerts. We think that we're the majority, but we're not by a long shot. The majority are the people with different concerns. And I can tell you that in Russia, in my opinion, the vast majority of people don't give a tinker's damn about freedom of speech. They don't care about freedom of the press. They care about other things, about how they're living, about whether or not they can feed themselves, about whether or not their children can go to school, about whether or not they have proper medical care. That's what they think about. Not about whether they can travel abroad. Not about whether they can eat pâté with foie gras. They don't really care about that, you know? And here's a man who suddenly is seen as someone who's going to stand up for Russia. And who's going to tell the West, you cannot treat us like a second-rate country. We will not allow it. He makes this speech in Munich in 2007. And from that point on, Putin in the West is seen as an enemy. Today, he is demonized. I mean, I've seen the covers of magazines, I can't believe my eyes. I've got one, I collect them, you know. There's one, Time magazine is about this big. And so the cover is red, and down here in the corner, down here, is little Mr. Putin walking, and he's casting a shadow. And the shadow is the Malaysian plane. Call that journalism? I mean, even in Russia they don't do that. So now, for the West, this is the boogeyman. This is the evil Soviet who's come back, KGB, and all of that. And we're back to square one to a certain extent, which is to say that we're enemies. But it's gotten worse, because back in Soviet times, there was virtually no anti-Americanism at the grassroots level. Just the regular people, Americans were Americans. In fact, they were pretty interesting. They were liked. Yeah, I didn't like Reagan. Soviet television told us terrible things about the American way of life. We had so-called political observers, journalists who went to America, came back with television stories about America. The people usually would turn off the sound and just look at the pictures. Today it's changed. Today there's real anti-American sentiment. Today we don't like the Americans. We don't like the Brits either. We don't like the West. Because we feel that we're under siege, that we're being attacked unjustly. I want to make it very clear that what's happening right now, which is obviously, it's the American initiative. As you know, in Europe there are different views as to how this should be managed. Great Britain, as usual, they'll excuse me for saying this, but I will say it, dances to the American tune. But not all countries do. And now you have these sanctions. Now what's the idea behind the sanctions? Well, the idea is to punish Russia. What does that really mean? You're not punishing Putin. You're punishing the average Russian because his standard of living is going down. The ruble, the price of things, inflation, his standard of living is going down. And the hope is that as his standard of living goes down, he'll blame Putin and will rise up against him. That's the idea. It's not going to work. It is not going to work. As a matter of fact, it makes Putin stronger. Why do you think he has an 85% support, popular support today? Precisely for that reason. Because it's seen as unjust. The Russians are tough. They've gone through God knows what kind of history. They can stand up to an enormous amount of pressure. If they consider that they're being unjustly punished, they can take it, and will take it, and will rally together to support the powers that be, in this case, Mr. Putin. It's an ill-devised policy. It will not lead to what it's supposed to lead, and probably will lead to the opposite. Sadly enough, I guess Mr. Obama can't back down, because if he does, it's seen as loss of face. And of course, he can't afford to do that because the elections are coming up. And so the Democrats are going to be in a difficult situation. They are anyway. So that's on the one hand. Obviously, Putin feels himself very strong in the sense of the support he's got back home. But again, he's not going to back down. I mean, if anyone thinks that he's going to give up Crimea, forget it. Never will do that. So that's where the situation stands. I believe it was a parliamentary commission, House of Lords, some time ago, came out with an analysis of what was going on and said that Europe and the UK had sleepwalked into the Ukrainian situation. Meaning by that the West had not understood what this could lead to, did not understand the relationship that existed between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has always seen Ukraine as part of Russia. Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire in 1653. Ukrainian is very similar to Russian. The religion is the same. Ukraine was always seen as the little brother, as it were. And it was usually called Malaya, smaller Russia. Even the word Ukraine was not often used. Doesn't mean that they can't be independent. They want to be independent, they should. But you cannot ignore Russia's interests. It just doesn't work. And I've often said, you know, many of you, I hear you speaking Russian, so I'm not going to ask you, but those of you who may not be that well acquainted, you see a map of Russia and where Ukraine is, you can place it, right? Now take a map of the United States and look at Mexico. There's a similarity, right? Now, imagine a revolution in Mexico, which isn't hard to imagine. And imagine this anti-American, which is also not hard to imagine. And here we have this new Mexican government, which feels somewhat threatened by Big Brother up in the north. So it invites a foreign army to protect its borders, the Russian army. You think the United States would permit this? Come on, of course it will. Neither will Russia permit this. Will not permit it. And if there's not this kind of understanding, you have to deal. There is a way to solve the problem. There are ways to deal with it. There are compromises to be made on both sides. Otherwise, this situation is going to get worse and worse, and in the long run, if nothing is done, there will be a military conflict. And since we have, on one hand, of course, the most powerful country in the world, the United States, but on the other hand, a country that does have nuclear weapons, the outcome is hardly one that is attractive. I find a lack of desire even to discuss. I find on both sides an incredible degree of stupidity, of trying to prove who's stronger. Doesn't serve anybody, it doesn't serve the people. It's self-serving, it's egoistic, and it's tremendously dangerous. So, I'm just looking, I don't want to, okay. Because I was told I have to stop at 7:20, and I want to give you plenty of time to ask me questions. So that is the way I see the situation. Now, I would also like you to understand that I do not support the policy of either country, of the United States or of Russia. Do not support it. What I've been trying to do is give you that part of the story that perhaps you haven't thought about. It's not in support of, it's clarification of. And those are different things. We're all victims of our own media. All of us are. We tend to, whether we like it or not, think in terms of what we're told on television, on radio, in the press. We think we're very independent. In reality, we are influenced. So the picture many of you have of Mr. Putin, who I happen to know, and whom I've spoken with, one-on-one in the Kremlin, believe it or not, is a very interesting gentleman. I wouldn't vote for him, which I told him, and you see I'm still alive. There are people here who think that there's no freedom of the press in Russia. Well, there is. Not like in the UK. But of course there is. And I could point out, what newspapers I'm talking about, what television I'm talking about, what radio I'm talking about, what I do. It's not black and white. It's not black hats versus white hats. It's much more complex. Both sides have their own legitimate geopolitical interests, which have to be taken into account. It cannot be a one-sided decision, and this is not an evil empire versus a city on the hill. It is not. So, basically that's what I wanted to tell you. I could talk about this much longer, in much greater detail, but since it's already, 7 to 7, and I have to be finished by 20 past 7, I was told, otherwise I'm going to be sent to Cornwall or Siberia. I have to say, go ahead. Thank you very much. And,
questions? We'll not be asking questions. There's two people, lovely assistants with microphones. Please keep your answers short.
no, questions.
My answer is I don't know. Yeah, keep your questions short. because keep in mind that both of you who want to ask questions. So yeah, I think we'll start from that gentleman over there in the white shirt. Yep.
Hi, my name is Pavel. Thank you for a very interesting speech. My question to you is, what are the biggest incentives, pull factors for a lot of us young, ambitious students to go back to Russia?
You know, that's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one for me to answer. I grew up, I was born in one country, I grew up in another country. I'm living in a third country. And one of my real problems has always been that I never felt truly at home, and that I was never fully accepted as being one of, even though I speak Russian without an accent. I'm still not Russian. So I think one of the problems is no matter how successful you are, I don't think you'll ever be accepted as being English. And I don't think you'll ever feel fully English. And that can be a problem. Some people don't care about it, but it can be. After going back to Russia, you know, it's really something that every person has to decide for himself. Is it easier, more comfortable, perhaps with a more promising future to stay in the UK? The answer is yes. No doubt about it. Do you care about the country where you were born? About the country where you grew up? Do you care about it? Well, if you do, then go back and do something about it. But this is something every person has to decide for himself. Is it your personal interests, or what? What is the deciding factor? If I felt it was dangerous to go back, don't. I'd say that. But that's not the case. At least not yet. We don't know how it may go. It's not easy to say. But I would always say I envy you that you're studying in this incredible place. I've been here, I think, 4 times, and every time I've been here, it's much better weather than this, by the way. I've always thought, wow, I wish I could have studied here. I wish I could have studied here. What an incredible atmosphere. And it doesn't matter, I'm a biologist by training, and I found out after my 3rd year, I guess, of biology, that I wasn't a scientist, that my brain was different. But I'm very happy that I studied it for 5 years, because it's given me a wonderful insight into who we are. I'm a physiologist. So I study here, whatever, it doesn't matter what, just to be in this, and I think you're tremendously privileged. Tremendously privileged, and you've earned it, I guess. But I would say, if you take this back to Russia, it's something you're giving the country. But I don't say do it. I say think about it. I certainly wouldn't want to be responsible for your decision. Either way. Yes, please.
Gentleman over there.
I was thinking of
Yes, just sort of grasping at straws. Do you see any statesman on either side that might be able to sort of rise up to the challenge? I think that you set.
Yes. Yeah, I know what you're saying. And sadly enough, the answer is no. I think there's an incredible lack of true statesmen nowadays. I don't see any anywhere. After all, most people seem to think that, at least in Europe, the leading figure is Angela Merkel. Well, more power to her. But she's not the caliber I'd be looking for in this case. You need someone who's ready for a breakthrough, like Gorbachev. Now, you know that he's very much disliked in Russia. He's got like maybe a 2% popularity rate, because he's seen as someone who destroyed the Soviet Union. Although it was actually Yeltsin who did it. We need someone who has the courage the integrity to stand up and say, this is something we have to do whether we like it or not. And to show the world that we really care. I don't see, I at this point don't see it. But you never know, these things happen, you know. Nobody knew that Gorbachev would appear. Nobody knew a year before it happened that there would be any more Soviet Union. So, you know, I'm always full of hope, but I can't give you any names. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Do you think that the notion of patriotism in Russia right now fueled more by anger and dislike of foreign enemies rather than love towards the homeland? And do you think that there are substantial differences between feeling of Russian patriotism and American and French patriotism, or elsewhere in that? Thank you.
Yes and no to all the above. When you say French patriotism, that's a very simple thing. I'm French. And let me tell you, we don't give a damn, except in certain cases. You know, in America, every baseball game in the major leagues, every football game in the NFL, every basketball game in the NBA, and every hockey game in the NHL starts with somebody coming out on the ice or on the field or a group and singing the national anthem. And the entire stadium gets up, and the men put their hands somewhere around where their heart's supposed to be. And the singer reaches the climax and says, "Oh, say do you, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave or the home of the free in the land of the brave?" Everybody goes, "Yes!" and they whistle and all of that. That's American patriotism. When I was going to school in America, the first lesson in every school in the land, almost, and in every grade, began with us reciting, "I swear allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one country, under God, indivisible, with justice and liberty for all." Every day. That's not the kind of patriotism that exists in this country. And it certainly isn't the kind that exists in Russia. However, your question initially is Russian patriotism today fueled by a sense of anger, by a sense of injustice? Yes, it is, to a very large degree. And in that sense, it is different. And in general, there's a lot of talk about patriotism. And in my view, it's very negative, because it leads to chauvinism, to supranationalism. This whole thing about being a patriot in Russia today has become a mantra, whereby you judge. Do you love Russia or do you not love Russia? You know, back in the bad old days in America when there was real racism, and if you said, well, I'm against it, I mean, the blacks are just as, well, back then you said the Negroes are just as good as us, you'd be asked, would you have your sister marry a nigger? And if you said yes, then you were a nigger lover, and people wouldn't talk to you. If you said no, well then obviously you're a racist too. So here it's the same thing. Are you a patriot or are you not? And when you say, well, not in your sense, they say, okay, now we know who you are.
It's only from here.
What is your view here?
Could you speak a little louder?
Yes, sure. What is your view on the murder of Boris Nemtsov?
What is my view on the murder of Vladimir Vladimirovich? Well, first of all, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy insofar as one individual is concerned, and I think it's a tragedy for the country. Ever since this happened, I've been trying to, for myself, answer the question, not who did it, But why? What was the reason? Who would want to kill Boris Nemtsov? Not just because he was a charming, intelligent, funny, very nice human being, but because politically, Boris Nemtsov was, okay, he led the opposition, and the opposition today in Russia is this big. You know, for Putin, hey, it was good that he was there. You could always say, see? We have opposition. It made no sense at all. I mean, you know, if you were a threat, looking at it cold-blooded, if we agree, if we all don't like Mr. Putin, and we all agree he's intelligent, he's calculating, he's a chess player, he's a former KGB agent, he thinks very carefully what's good for him and what's not. If we agree to that, then how could he possibly be behind the assassination of Boris Nemtsov? Makes no sense at all. It's terribly counterproductive. The entire world, look at what's going on. Of course it's the Kremlin. Of course it's Putin. Things are bad, well now they're worse. So when I say that, I think, well maybe there's a group that wants things to be worse. Maybe there's what we call a party of war in Russia that wants Russia to be isolated from the rest of the world, that does not want you people studying here, does not want that because you're being affected by a system that's not the one we want to have. So better not come back, as a matter of fact. I would say that that's much more, I can understand that, because of all the opposition that exists today in Russia, certainly he was the most flamboyant, the most interesting, and the most liked. So perhaps that's the answer. I really don't know, but I don't see any other explanation except something almost accidental, which I don't think is the case.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I'd like to ask, what would you suggest for a person who wants to know what's actually going on and not to be biased by the media?
I would suggest trying to read different viewpoints and listen to different viewpoints, and they exist. For instance, I read, besides the different Russian periodicals, I read the New York Times on a regular basis. I very often read The Economist. I watch BBC World Service, to a lesser degree CNN, which has become really not very interesting. But I try to get as many different views as possible, in addition to whatever I have as a journalist, whatever I run into. That's time consuming. And it's not always what you want to do. So what I would say is this: either you say to yourself, I don't have the time for this, so I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to admit that my views are impacted by what I do read, and therefore perhaps I'm not totally right. Or make the effort, because there is no other way. There's no magical wand to wave and say, now I understand the situation. It's not the way it works. It's something that calls for an effort. It does. And I don't know whether, in the United States there are a couple of outlets that are actually really very good. One is NPR, National Public Radio, which is absolutely outstanding. And every now and then in a monthly magazine called Foreign Affairs, you can get some very profound, interesting articles on what's going on. But by and large, they're hard to find.
Let's take Hang it over there.
Place with men.
Vladimir Vladimirovich, thank you very much for your interest in lecture and for your art and TV in general.
Thank you.
There is a lot of cry and a lot of screaming that in Russia, power is bad, government is bad, Putin is bad, everything is bad.
Right.
But isn't that the real distinction point of real politician? To come and say, okay guys, this is where I want to take my country.
Right.
This is what I want to do for you.
Yes.
And that's how I'm going to make it.
Yes.
Isn't that what Nehru was doing? Isn't that what Nehru in India?
Yeah.
Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, I can go on forever. To create the movement and take people there.
Yes.
And not to cry so that something does not let you do.
Well, yes. Is that so? I would say that in what concerns Russia today, I would say the majority of people don't know what the priorities are. There is no clarity that here's what we want to do. They're general words, combat to corruption, overcome the gap between the rich and the poor. These are all things that have been said by every politician that ever existed, and there's no clarity there. The lack of understanding leads to the lack of desire. People really don't care. There is no such thing as doing something for the country. It's all about me. And it's mainly about money. Nowadays in Russia, it's about money. Because what people have seen is if you've got money, then you're okay. You're pretty independent and you're living a good life. If you don't, then things are terrible. And since they've been burned by ideology, they've been lied to so many times, they've been misled so often, their sacrifices have been for nothing so often that they become somewhat cynical. They don't believe anybody, except they believe actions rather than words. So they've seen Putin deliver in the sense of bringing Russia back and making the rest of the world admit that yes, Russia is here, like it or dislike it. And for that, they're very thankful. They do not believe in any of the other politicians. The majority of people couldn't care less about the Duma, even less about the government. It's every man for himself. But Putin, in that sense, stands out because of what he's done, insofar as most people are concerned. You have people who can't stand him, but they are a minority.
Thank you very much for the talk, very interesting. Something you mentioned during the talk that Russia will not allow NATO on its borders because it perceives it as a threat. And so this is not the first time, I guess, many of us hear that. But something that's not quite clear to me is that what exactly is it that Russia is afraid of NATO on its border? And at the same time, the price of not letting NATO on its borders are the sanctions, the falling ruble, inflation that, as you said, is something that the average Russian feels. So my question is, effectively, what is to fear? What should the Russians fear more? NATO on its borders, or the sanctions and the economic collapse of the country?
I can only give you my understanding. I have not seen any polls that would confirm what I'm going to say. NATO is seen as an enemy, as a military force that is already on Russia's border in two countries, in Estonia and in Latvia. That, in fact, NATO is an arm of the United States foreign policy, that the United States is trying to encircle Russia, and that obviously a military force on Russia's border is threatening per se, because it's right there. In what concerns inflation, let me go to the crash of the ruble. For most Russians, the crash of the ruble really doesn't mean all that much because they don't travel. Most. Because it's if you travel, then suddenly you begin to understand that if you traveled a year ago, your ruble was worth, it was 28 rubles to the dollar, and now it's 60. And that changes everything. But for the majority of people inside Russia, some things have become more expensive, things that were bought for dollars, they become more expensive. But those are not things that the average guy buys. They're things for the privileged people. So there's that difference. And then, as you said, there's the inflation. And people don't like inflation, there's no doubt about it. But what they're saying is, it's those Americans who are making us suffer. It's not our fault. They want us to live worse. Well, we'll take it. So it's not a question of fear. They're not threatened in the sense of they'd be threatened by a military force. And it's not, they have no choice. It's either. Or let's say they were asked, look, give up Ukraine, give back Crimea, and you won't have inflation. No. Absolutely not. The vast majority will say, go to hell. We have 5 minutes.
Yes, I think we will extend it by another 5 minutes to 9:25.
That's all. Okay, fine.
My question is about your journalistic experience in Korea. When was the most interesting time to work for the Russian TV and
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. You can speak a bit louder.
Okay. My question is about your journalistic career. When was the most interesting time to work for Russian TV, and when was the hardest one? Thanks.
Well, I began working as what might be called a journalist during Soviet times. And of course, I wasn't a journalist, I was a propagandist. I was someone who was, first of all, I was working not for the local people. I was working for a foreign audience, basically for the United States. I worked in radio, and I broadcast to the United States. Not, strictly speaking, it was not journalism, and it's something I regretted. I don't want to go into that, but that's the case. When I finally was able to become a journalist during Gorbachev's time, I found that to be amazingly interesting. And it's been that way ever since. Now, there was a time when I worked in America, from 1991 to 1997. I was doing a show with a man by the name of Phil Donahue, who in those days was very famous in America. And the show was called Pozner and Donahue. And when I asked him, when the show was first envisioned, I asked him, why not Donahue and Pozner? You're the more important person in America. He said, well, in case it bombs, better be Pozner and Donahue. We did very well, but I want to tell you, what happened was that we were doing this for a cable company called CNBC. We've got a new president by the name of Roger Ailes, who is now the head of Fox News. And Roger Ailes, when time came to renew our contract, he called us in and he said, look, we'll renew your contract, we had very good ratings, but only if you agree, A, to tell us in advance what you're going to talk about, and B, who you're going to invite. You have too many liberals on your show. And I said, Mr. Ailes, that's called censorship. And he said, and I quote, I don't give a rat's ass what you call it. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. And Donahue said, I'm not. And so our contract was not renewed, and our show disappeared. That's called freedom of the press. And nobody said anything. So that's just an example of the kind of things I've been through. I find it very difficult today, much more difficult than during the workshop period, because of the general control that's exercised by the Kremlin. I'm lucky in that, because of, I guess, my reputation, I'm able to do things other people can't do. I find it amazingly interesting, but very difficult. At times it's very difficult to do.
Take a look at the insistent person over there.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Sergey. So you asked not to make a speech, so I'll try to keep it short, but I have a few points I want to raise. Speaking of coming back to Russia, I'd absolutely love to, but unfortunately I don't have the freedom since about 2006. So, no permission. Then you also said that there's freedom of speech in Russia. I'm not really sure you can say there's a freedom of speech in a country where the government decides which channels can have advertisers and which can't. But my actual question is, do you have any sort of explanation for the internal policies in Russia, which, if anything, make life harder for Russian people? They don't have anything to do with the foreign policy. So the laws and the behavior of the Russian government literally inside the country, which only makes it harder for Russian people to live, as opposed to anything else.
I wish you could repeat the question.
Right, sure. So, do you have any sort of explanation for why Russian internal policy, if anything, makes it harder for Russian people to live? Or a lot of laws, a lot of the ways things are done in Russia?
Look, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what you're asking me. Maybe it's because of the sound. Could you, maybe someone else repeat?
I think his question is like, do you have explanations for the internal policies in Russia?
Yeah.
And the one which are making it bad for your most of the people living there. Explain why they're doing it, even if it's making people life worse.
So, sorry, I can just briefly add. You've been talking a lot about foreign policy and trying to explain. Wait, is that better? Yeah. So you've been talking a lot about foreign policy.
Sorry.
You've been talking a lot about foreign policy and explaining what motivates Russia to do certain things.
Right.
And my question was about internal policy. What possible explanation could there be for Russia?
Well, first of all, I would question your knowledge of internal domestic policy in Russia. And in addition to that, I would say, were it not a policy that the majority of people do not oppose, they would not be supporting Putin the way they do. Now, generally speaking, most Russians traditionally say, we can't do anything about it anyway. We can't control the government, so we just live our lives. Since their lives have become much better materially, and that's what a lot of people care about, first and foremost, but not only materially. They can read whatever books they want to read. Once upon a time they couldn't. They can see any kind of movie you can see. Once upon they couldn't. They can watch on television all kinds of American serials. Once upon they couldn't. They have all of that as well. They can travel. And the only roadblock to their traveling is money or a foreign government, not the Russian government. It's whether the foreign government will give them a visa. So they've really got very little to complain about, except what you would call the possibility to criticize the government. But that's never been a big deal in Russia. It's never been a big deal. People don't really care all that much about it. So that the domestic policy for most people today, certainly not for all, not for me, but for most people, is absolutely fine. And when you say, I'm not sure I can call freedom of speech, who cares what you call? Who cares? You're living here, you're living there. And you don't want to go back. And they say, okay, don't.
I can't say.
Oh, you can't. Well, whatever. But
We'll be taking our
a good one, see?
Yes. Nice.
Gentleman right down here, I'd like to. Give him the mic, please. Give him my mic.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to know what chance for world stability when to the United Nations Security Council give this type of example?
I'm a supporter of the UN. And the fact that the United Nations Security Council is made up of countries that can veto a decision and make it impossible to implement has its positive aspects. And I guess without the UN, things would probably be much worse. But I do not have the feeling that nowadays the UN is really contributing the way it should to, or the way it could, let me put it that way, the way it could, to international security. And perhaps the most serious thing for me is that the vast majority of us really don't do much to make this place a better world. We don't. We ask a lot of questions, we criticize, and when it comes to doing something, we tend not to. So I have to say that I'm not overly optimistic about where we're going. I think that probably you will live less well than I've lived, and your children will live less well than you, unless there's some really, really basic changes in the world and the attitude towards the planet we live on, the water we drink, the air we breathe, just so much more, what we consume, just so much more important than all of these other things. I'm hoping that the younger generation of people is beginning to understand that, and that you have to participate. If you don't, it's like the person who told me, I don't care about politics. To which I say, yeah, but politics care about you. So we'll see. At any rate, I hope that what I've said. Now, I was told the last time there was a Russian here, which I'm not, but the last time there was someone from Russia, there were people from Ukraine who were very loud, critical of what he said, and I was waiting for this to happen to me, and it didn't for some strange reason. Maybe there are no Ukrainians, I don't know. But I just want to make it very clear that I was here to try to explain, and not at all to justify. Those are different things. When you understand one thing, it's not the same thing as when you justify. I want to thank you for your attention, the fact that there's so many of you. Wish you good luck. And repeat that I envy you terribly for being students of this incredible place. Thank you.